Frances Pickering, who is Executive Director of the WestCog. Now, Frances, I'm going to kick things off with you. I want to start off with the Fair Share Bill. There have been many issues with this one, issues with environmental protection, the cityification of the suburbs, the extreme budgetary impact it will have on our local municipalities and communities, and just, the lack of input on the implementation of it. Can you explain what the Fair Share Bill is, how it will impact our communities, especially with the budgetary issue, because that's something that keeps coming up a lot?
Sure.
And where we are in the process.
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Alexis, for the invitation to come here tonight. We are a nonpartisan group at the COG, and we strongly support affordable housing. And this year, as every year, there are good bills, there are bad bills, and there are ugly bills. And just to be clear, there are good housing bills out there. I would categorize this as an ugly housing bill. Fair Share is a bill that would require the state to determine the need for affordable housing in every community statewide, which in principle sounds like a good idea, but it presumes that the state understands exactly what the need is. The sponsors of the bill, the Open Communities Alliance, have released a spreadsheet showing how many units would be built under Fair Share, their estimate in every community. And their estimates are relatively, I would say, detached from market demand and need in many parts of the state. They call for the construction of dozens to hundreds of units in municipalities where there has been little to no demand. Now, that is not necessarily southwestern Connecticut, but a town like Union, Connecticut, whose population has grown 3% in 200 years, would have to build dozens of units. Now, what's interesting about Fair Share is that under the proposal, every town, the state would determine how many units are needed in every town, at what income levels, with what number of bedrooms, what age of the residents, and whether owned or rented units. So it's very prescriptive in that regard. And then the municipalities would have to develop, every municipality except for Hartford, New Haven, Waterbury, Bridgeport, New Britain, and Wyndham would have to develop a fair share plan within 1 year. And that plan will lay out how those units will be built within 10 years. Fair Share calls for building 121,000 housing units in 10 years. That's enough to house 300,000 people. There's no reason to believe Connecticut's population will grow that fast. Our population has been relatively slow growing or stagnant. Not that that's a good thing, but that's just the reality. And if a municipality does not adopt the plan, then they are subject to default zoning, which is 20 units per acre by right, so no special permits, everywhere where there's public water and sewer, and where there's no public water and sewer, essentially no maximum density except what is limited environmentally and in terms of public health. A lot of people have been concerned about the default zoning. I'm personally not so concerned about that because I think every municipality facing that specter would adopt a fair share plan. What's really concerning in the bill to me is that it puts the responsibility for housing creation on municipalities. So the bill provides extraordinary standing before the court for Open Communities Alliance and their partners to sue municipalities if the housing goals are not met within 3, 5, or 10 years. So if 121,000 units are not built in 10 years statewide, then every municipality that fails to meet their fair share goal, even if the cause of the units not being built, for instance, is a recession and demand dries up, or there's inadequate tradespeople to build it, or mortgage rates are too high, lending rates are too high for developers to have an interest, or there's been no population growth for 200 years. If a municipality fails to build those units, they can be sued and forced by the courts to build them at public expense. And that's really, I want to underline that. This is not like 830G, where a developer can take a town to court and have the zoning set aside to build at his or her own expense. This is going to court and saying, I don't care what happened. Maybe there's no demand. Maybe there's a recession. The units weren't built. I'm going to sue the town. I'm going to collect lawyers' fees as I sue the town. And I'm going to force the town to enter into an agreement with developers to build these units. And now in some towns there may be demand. but we haven't built 120,000 units per decade in Connecticut in 40 plus years. This is an unrealistic rate. We probably don't even have the tradespeople to build it. Definitely not the demand. And the fair share goals, in my view, are unrealistic. They are setting towns up to fail. It's really a green light for advocacy organizations to have a field day in court suing municipalities, winning lawyers' fees, and forcing construction. And the most disturbing thing about it is that it doesn't even respond to the needs of the people who are currently struggling to pay their mortgages or rents right now. Instead of helping them out, it says, look, we built a brand new housing unit of taxpayer expense somewhere else in the state, and maybe you can move there. Our estimate, and it's a very conservative estimate of the cost of fair share, is that it will cost $20 billion, which will be borne fully on the backs of local governments, which means by taxpayers. And that equates to a 20% increase in property taxes statewide. That would make Connecticut number one at something, unfortunately, something ignominious, but we would be number one in the effective property tax burden in the entire country. We'd pull ahead of New Jersey, which is the inspiration for fair share. And that's what's so concerning to us is if we look at the taxes in Connecticut, the property tax is by far the largest tax. It's a very regressive tax. And raising it even further actually works against housing affordability and works against economic growth and equity in Connecticut. So we think it's a really bad policy, and we hope that the General Assembly agrees.
Now, can someone talk more about the litigation aspect of fair share and how, who would have standing? I know, Francis, you talked about that in the beginning, but can you go back to that? I think that's something people want to really dive into.
Yeah, so it's an interesting model. Fair share emerged out of a court case in New Jersey in 1975. A series of court cases went to their Supreme Court called the Mount Laurel cases. And they have a different constitution than we do. This has not been litigated and kind of the same outcome in Connecticut. There have been about 40 years of litigation in New Jersey on fair share. It's been essentially continual since it went into effect. And generally speaking, to sue a town, you have to, to sue anybody in court, you have to have standing. Standing is a fundamental principle of our legal system. And you have to have suffered an actual injury and sue for it. Fair share would essentially say affordable housing advocates and the developers of affordable housing would not have to suffer any injury. In fact, they would not even have to be involved in a town. They would be automatically granted standing and could sue the town if the requisite housing units are not built, even if it's not the town's fault they haven't been built. So it basically gives them a, if somebody tried to sue a town right now on these grounds, they would be thrown out for lack of standing. And that's what's so concerning about it. And there's an incentive for, as I mentioned before, the targets that are set for the towns are completely unrealistic. Even the private sector couldn't meet them right now. Even if you paid every developer in Connecticut, you probably could not meet them. So they've set up unrealistic targets. Fair share does provide attorney's fees for the plaintiffs in the cases. And the plaintiff could be an affordable housing developer, and the court could order the town then to hire that developer to build the housing. So it's a really concerning model with respect to good governance. What's not clear in the bill is whether the plaintiffs could also receive punitive damages. And given what we're talking about here in terms of the housing costs, those could also be quite substantial. So it's not an improvement to our court system. I'll leave it that way.
Thank you. That's a very thorough explanation. Thank you.